Professor Marietjie Venter is a medical virologist at the University of Pretoria. She's been doing research on lions. Professor, good afternoon to you, and thank you for your time. I have to start with this. How do you find out if a lion has COVID-19?
Good afternoon, Stephen. So I'm a medical virologist, and at the University of Pretoria we have a very active One Health system. So I work very closely with the veterinary specialists, the wildlife vets at the University of veterinary faculty. And so luckily they swapped the lions. I didn't have to swap them. But what they did really is when we got a call from the private zoo to tell us that they had some lions that had respiratory signs, Professor Katja Kuppel and her team then went out and they tranquilized the lions. And let me tell you, you tranquilize them and then you check if they're awake and then you tranquilize them again before you put your arm down their throat, because that's actually how they took the swabs. So they took oral pharyngeal swabs, so deep throat swabs, to test them.
A very brave thing to do. What impact does it have on a lion? We know what COVID-19 does to us. We're a mammal, so I'm presuming the fact that we have lungs, mammalian lungs, so does a lion. It's part of the feline family. We have that in common, along with hamsters as well. They will also have lungs, much smaller ones. So what impact does this disease, if we know what it does to us, can it have on animals?
So the lion specifically was during the Delta wave in South Africa. And they had difficult breathing, so they showed some respiratory signs. They had blocked noses and then also, like I said, had trouble breathing and they were coughing. And the one lioness actually developed pneumonia. So the clue to us was really that this was potentially COVID because it was at the peak of the Delta wave, but also because she didn't respond to antibiotics. So the veterinarian took a sample and then they sent it to my lab at University of Pretoria Medical School. So we have a high-level containment lab. It's a BSL-free lab where we work with zoonotic diseases, which is diseases that transmit from animals to humans. So we tested it for COVID-19 and 3 of the lions tested positive, and they were in 2 different cages. So something told us that, there was some sort of transmission between them. And we then went back the next day and we worked with the zoo and they identified people that could potentially be in contact with these lions. And we swapped 12 people and also bled them. And one of the people, that was the big cat keeper that was responsible for looking after the lions, actually tested COVID positive. He was asymptomatic at that stage, but the next day he actually developed symptoms and also went to a private lab to be confirmed. So we call this a One Health investigation. So it means we will investigate both the human and the animals, and also then the environment where they are kept to see, how could it possibly be transmitted. So firstly, we then did a genomic study. So we do the genome sequence, and we identified the Delta variant in all 3 of the lions, and then also in the human. And it was the same strain. There was later another person that also tested positive that actually became sick from the zoo, but he was responsible for fixing the cages and so on, so he didn't have direct contact with them, and he had a different strain, so it was clear that he was not part of the outbreak.
At this stage, so it seems then from what you're saying, and this may be important, I don't know, that it went from a human being to a lion in one move, which could mean then that the lion could now infect another human being. Now, the reason that this is important is that many people in South Africa have house cats. A normal domestic feline. I can't remember the Latin name for it right now. But what that means is that if it can infect a lion, it could infect a cat, and the cat could infect another human being.
So firstly, just in this specific case, I must just clarify. So a lion is like humans with developed acute disease. It means the virus will clear. They don't become chronic carriers, and they're not chronically infected. So the lions that we tested were basically positive for 7 weeks, which is quite long and was surprising to us because during this time they can then potentially transmit to other animals in the zoo. And also, it highlights the importance of humans coming in contact with animals in captivity to actually take precautions, to be vaccinated and to wear masks, and also have other precautions such as sterilizing the cages when they go in. But the lions eventually cleared the infection. So we worked with the Department of Agriculture, and they put the lions under quarantine, and that's why we went back and we could actually do this study, that we swapped them for a couple of times every 2 weeks or so until they tested negative. And so we know they're negative at this stage. There is, of course, a smaller risk for lions to infect humans. A zoo is a different, artificial environment, obviously, for them. So in a zoo, the risk would be to either the people that look after them, but also to the public. So it's important that the zoo put some barriers in place. But in a zoo, the problem is actually more towards the animals, because there's so many endangered species in a zoo. You don't want the animals to be infected and potentially die of COVID. So coming back to your cats, cats can actually get COVID. And when the whole pandemic started, there were some tigers that were infected in the Bronx Zoo. And that was the first clue that cats could potentially be, a target of COVID. It's not the only species, though. But there was a couple of cats, house cats, that tested positive, and also some that transmitted to others. But it's not very common. But it's important that people that actually develop COVID realize this. Dogs is a little bit less susceptible, but they can also be infected. So if you and your family potentially have COVID, it's important actually that you don't cuddle with your animals and sleep with them in the same bed, because they can get sick from you. They don't get very severe disease, although there has been a lion in India actually that also got the Delta variant and that died. So it is possible that the variants, as they evolved, became more infectious. The Delta variant was very infectious and quite pathogenic, and that may have been more pathogenic to animals as well than the initial variant.
Do we know why cats and dogs, and I think a lot of people are suddenly going to focus on this, why they don't seem to get it as badly as humans? I mean, is there something about our lungs? Is there something about particular variants? Is there something about their lungs that maybe means they don't get the pneumonia so quickly or so easily?
I think it's a combination of different things, but there's not a lot of studies done, though. So in Africa, this is really the only published study ever in cats or big cats. From the whole continent. So when you identify a notifiable disease, it has to be reported to the OIE. So the OIE is the same as WHO for animals. And if you go and look at the map, our study, and then previously in the same zoo, we found infected pumas, and they are the only ones that's been reported. I think it's unlikely that it's the only one. So if at the moment we actually recommend that there should be a bit more investigation into animals. So there's about 6 million genome sequence of COVID-19 or for SARS-CoV-2 on the databases for humans, but there's only about 1,000 specimens or 1,000 sequences for animals. So I think it's not as well studied. And obviously, you're not going to do infection experiments into lions to see what percentage of them will die. But to the date, it seems like it is less infectious.
We've been talking, and there's been a huge, in a way, a political fight over how COVID-19 came into human beings, and the general thesis has been that it probably came from bats in China and then moved into human beings from there. In this case, it seems then that humans transmitted the disease to, in this case, big cats, lions and tigers. Does that happen often, that humans actually give other animals a disease? And I'm reminded that there's another disease called feline HIV, for example, which is clearly related to the human HIV.
Yeah, so feline HIV is not related to human HIV at all. It's a completely different virus. Most of the zoonoses are really known to have passed from animals to humans. So, for example, HIV, the original HIV, is thought to have come from chimpanzees or similar apes, and passed on to humans, where then changed and adapted to humans. There are a couple of diseases that can transmit back to animals. Most of our concern is normally actually from animals to humans, though. So, but it's also because that's more studied. But to give you some examples, the TB, for example, can pass from animals to humans, but also back from humans to animals. And there are some TB strains, human TB strains that would infect apes. So many of the apes would be very sensitive then to human diseases. There was a couple of studies done in Central Africa where they look at the gorillas as well, and the gorillas would actually get lots of similar diseases than us. So some of them had respiratory syncytial virus and human metapneumovirus, which is all human respiratory viruses that were transmitted and those are human diseases that were actually transmitted to them. So it all depends on the receptors of the virus, how similar it is, and if they can use similar receptors to us.
Professor, I really appreciate the time. So interesting, such an important conversation, I think, in many different ways. Professor Marietjie Venter is a medical virologist at the University of Pretoria. Prof, really do appreciate it. Thank you.